In this position, black's connected pawns are the B and C pawn. The G4 pawn is nothing to worry about, but it has to be taken into account. What does white need to do here? The crucial move is rook to E8. The reason is the rook needs to reach the second rank and control all of it. So, of course, we couldn't play rook to F8 because G3 stops the rook from going down and we're losing the tempo, which is crucial. Same thing with rook H8. G3 would have stopped us and no other file is available, so rook E8 is the only move here. So, what does black do? Let's see G3 for example, rook E2. Now the black king will have to move. Well, of course, G2 just loses pawn like that, and the rook in E2 or the rook in G2 or in any other square of the second rank will be guarding all of it. So the rook will just be happy to go and pick up the pawn and black wouldn't achieve anything. So after a move like king, let's say king A3, white plays king to C4. The idea is to put pressure on C3. Again, the G pawn is stuck there. It's completely useless. It can push if it wants to, but it doesn't make any progress for black. So now king A4 comes with a checkmate, so that's not possible. There's no other moves except, well, C2 is taken by the rook, and so after B3 white takes the pawn and the king keeps supporting the B2 square, and so the second file is attacked both by the king and the rook. Now what can black do? Again, pushing the pawn to G2 is pointless, it just gets taken. Moving the king away allows rook to B2, and now there's two attackers on this pawn. Pushing the pawn now is pointless, rook takes, and then king goes back to A3 protecting the pawn, but then rook B2, and this pawn will be taken next move. So going back a few moves, after the rook E2 move, if the king goes to A4, that doesn't make any difference. King C4 comes, and now king A3 is met by a nice Zugzwang, because right now, well, king A4 will lead to a checkmate, whereas, well, the black king cannot go anywhere else. The pawn will be taken, and G2 will be taken. So after B3, rook takes pawn, pins this pawn, there's double attack on it, and it's going to be inevitably taken. What happens after G2 here, trying to distract the rook? Well, then rook takes pawn, it comes with check, then the rook will just go and reach the G file and take the pawn next move. So back at the original position. After rook to E2, what happens after king B2? The king is trying to progress his position in helping the pawn to guard the promotion square. Rook E2 comes, and then when the king goes back to B3 with a similar position to before, the rook will simply go to G2 and wait for a move. So pawn down will be taken, and then as soon as the king moves again, then we can do the usual infiltration with the king. What happens after G3? Black is trying to gain a tempo. White now just puts the black player in Zugzwang. Rook E2. Simple. The pawn cannot push because it will be taken, and this pawn also cannot push. And now black has to play a move, and whatever he does, there's going to be king C4 and the usual patterns. B3, then king can happily take this pawn. The black pawns will not be able to reach the second rank anytime. In this position, black has two connected pawns again and one isolated. The move now is rook to E8. The reason is the rook starts putting pressure on a pawn that can be targeted immediately. Now, it can be argued that this pawn doesn't have to be taken immediately because it can either push or it can be defended by king d5. But the point is, we've got to target the weaknesses of our opponent and force a reply. If we don't make a move that threatens to take something immediately, our opponent will have a chance of making a slower plan but more effective one. So after rook e8 attacking the pawn, let's say black pushes the pawn. Now this is exactly what we wanted, because now the king can go d3 and these pawns aren't going anywhere, because the pawn in d4 will never be able to actually give support to the pawn in e3. Yeah, it's supporting it right now, but it's not going to be able to support it later when the pawn will want to be more ambitious and go and promote. So what does black play? Well, moving the king will be pointless, simply because the check will give white double attack on this pawn, and so the king will have to move away, and then the rook can take the pawn, and after pawn to b3, maybe the rook will just move away, controlling the fourth rank forever. The black king will not be able to go down, and the white king will be able to go and pick up the pawn, whilst the white rook on the other side will be doing the exact same thing. So here again, the white king is now in d3, excellent square. And what if black plays something like b3, then simply rook to b8. Again, this king is doing an excellent job keeping an eye on both pawns. This rook is now attacking b3, and the goal is to take it. So after king to d5, the rook will just take the pawn. So for example, rook takes, and now what can this king do? Well, nothing, can't go down, so it's gonna have to stay somewhere there. And I would just make a Zugzwang move, which is basically rook b2. The king will not be able to reach the b file, neither c4 because of the king. This pawn will not be able to push without being taken, so after the king moves back, we reach b4. Now we're putting double attack on this pawn, and we will eventually take it with the rook. If black pushes e2, then rook comes here with check, and whatever happens next, the rook will just simply control the pawn. Right, back at the initial position. After rook to e8, we were putting pressure on the targetable pawn. So after king to d5, the black player doesn't want to push this pawn in order not to make the white king very strong. After king to d5, here's how we play this endgame. Rook to c8 stops the king from going to the c file, making the b pawn a future target. What does black play right now? Well, e3 comes with the same position as before, so king d3. And what happens after pawn to b3? Now a lovely zugzwang move. Rook to c7. The reason why we can't play rook to b8, for example, is because king c4 will be defending the pawn, and we kind of just messing around a bit. So we have to play rook to c7 now, so that the king is blocked from going anywhere on the c file. And if king were to attack the rook, then finally rook b8, rook b7 is fine. Now we can attack this pawn because it can never be protected by anyone. And after something like b2, again, rook b7, the pawn is very far from the king, so it will be able to be taken. And after that, it's going to be easy life to finish this game. Let's say something slightly different than before. Let's say pawn to d3. Now we simply take the pawn. And what's black going to do next? We can't push the pawn because they both get taken soon. King d4 is met by a check. This is attacking the pawn, so the king will not be able to go and attack the rook in c5. So after a move like this, d5, king d5, king e3, there's a double attack on this pawn, and we're going to take it. In this position, the white rook needs to go to f8. It's important to make the threat of taking something immediately so that we can predict a reply, we can force a reply. So after pawn to f3, king to c2, it's important that the king will have to go to the area where these two more threatening pawns are, whereas we don't really have to worry about this pawn. And now after king to c2, what does black play? Well, b4 is met by rook to f4. And now this rook is attacking g4. The idea is to take it, and then this pawn in f3 is not close enough to the end. And so the rook is simply able to take in g4 and then go back to f4 and take the pawn straight after promotion. So rook f4 is our best move. Now what does black play? Well, black will have to take some initiative. So let's say b3 comes with check, gets the king away from the area where these two pawns are. So after king takes. So this was an interesting idea because that allows the black player to go to d5 and soon attack the white rook. After this move, the white rook cannot take the pawn in g4 for a simple reason. After taking the pawn, the black player, yes, he cannot go to the fourth rank, but he will go to e5, stopping the rook from going to f4. And now we have a problem. So what to do? Well, simply we need to bring the king closer. King c3, and after king to e5, the rook plays a brilliant move. Rook back to f8. Keeps an eye on this pawn, keeps an eye on the f3 pawn. The pawn cannot push without being taken. And after king to e4, only move that makes sense, white plays king to d2 and reaches the area of these two pawns. What does black do? Well, black will have to push this pawn, and now king e1. It's very simple. There's nothing to worry about. These pawns coming down. A move like g2 is met by the usual king here protecting and doing some sort of opposition to the opponent king, and never allowing this pawn to promote. A move like this check, for example, is met by king f1. The king is happy to stay on the same file of the opponent's pawn that is closest to promotion. This pawn cannot push. What happens after king to e3? Well, simply king to g2. The king is protecting the square of promotion. And so what does black do? Well, black can only play king e2. And this comes with a zugzwang. We're going to force white to make a move he doesn't want to make. So rook to f3. Forcing black to either move this pawn, promote, and then we can take it with a rook, or move the king away. If the king goes back to e1, which makes much more sense, then simply check. This will deflect the king away. The king is controlling f1, and after this check, king d2, then the white rook can take the pawn. And there's no stopping this rook from reaching the f3 square. It was crucial that the king got as close as possible to the rook, because alone rooks could be a little bit inefficient sometimes, but together with the king, they make a good pair, especially against connected pawns.